They tried to ban this root. It kept people alive script. The living archive. It doesn't need good soil. It doesn't need the right season. It doesn't need a farmer's attention. It grows in the margins, in neglected ground, in cracked, dry earth, in the places where every other crop gives up. For centuries, it was there, quiet, persistent, feeding people who had no other option. And yet, for most of modern history, this root has been treated as a sign of failure, associated with the desperate, the displaced, the people without access to something better. In some eras, its cultivation was quietly discouraged. In others, it was pushed aside entirely, as agricultural systems reorganized around crops that were easier to trade, easier to market, and far more profitable to sell. What was lost in that reorganization wasn't the plant itself. The plant survived, as it always has. What was lost was the knowledge of how to use it. That root is cassava. And its history is not what most people expect. Cassava belongs to the genus manioc. It's native to the tropical and subtropical regions of South America. Archaeological evidence places its domestication in the western Amazon basin, possibly as far back as 8,000 years ago. The people who first cultivated it weren't botanists. They were communities working with what their environment offered, learning through practice which roots could be eaten, which required processing, and which could carry a household through a dry season when everything else failed. What made cassava exceptional wasn't taste. It has none of the sweetness of grains that would later dominate global food systems. What made it exceptional was endurance. It tolerates poor soil. It survives drought. It can be left in the ground for months without spoiling, essentially functioning as a living storage system. In climates where flooding, unpredictable rainfall, and depleted fields were the norm, this wasn't a minor quality. It was a survival mechanism. From South America, cassava spread to the Caribbean, to Central America, and eventually, through trade, migration, and the violence of the Atlantic slave trade, to Africa and parts of Asia, where it would become foundational to the diets of hundreds of millions of people. But here is where the story gets complicated. Because cassava has a secret, one that has shaped its entire history. Raw cassava contains cyanogenic glucosides, compounds that, when broken down inside the human body, can produce hydrogen cyanide. This is not a minor issue. Insufficient quantities, improperly prepared cassava causes serious illness. In cases of prolonged exposure, permanent neurological damage. The people who domesticated cassava solved this problem. Over generations, they developed processing techniques, soaking, fermentation, pressing, grating, drying, that break down or remove the toxic compounds before consumption. The knowledge was accumulated across centuries, passed through communities, tested by practice, and it worked. But here's what happens when that knowledge is disrupted. When communities are displaced. When bitter varieties are introduced into regions unfamiliar with traditional techniques. A condition called konzo, a permanent spastic paralysis caused by chronic cyanide exposure, has been documented in parts of sub-Saharan Africa. Almost always in populations facing extreme scarcity, who consumed improperly processed cassava because they had nothing else. The root wasn't the problem. The absence of the processing tradition was. By the time European colonizers reached the Americas, cassava had already been feeding large populations for millennia. The Spanish and Portuguese recognized immediately what it could do, and they used it as rations for enslaved workers, as emergency food when imported supplies ran low, as a crop that grew fast on land that had been stripped of everything. But cassava never entered the European dietary imagination as a valued food. It was classified as food for people without access to something better. In the hierarchies that governed colonial food systems, wheat was associated with civilization. Cassava was associated with the poor, the indigenous, the enslaved. Growing it, eating it, even knowing how to prepare it. All of it carried social meaning, and that meaning discouraged adoption among anyone who had another choice. The stigma didn't hold everywhere. In West Africa and parts of Central Africa, cassava became a genuine staple, not a food of last resort, a daily foundation. Fufu, a fermented dough made from cassava, became central to diets across the continent. The knowledge of preparation was preserved, adapted, and passed on. Today, Nigeria is the world's largest producer of cassava. Across sub-Saharan Africa, it feeds more people than any other crop. So what does cassava actually contain? Because the simplified version, that it's mostly starch with little nutritional value, is only partially true. Cassava is high in resistant starch, a form of carbohydrate that behaves differently from simple sugars. Resistant starch isn't broken down in the small intestine. It reaches the colon, where it feeds beneficial bacteria and supports digestive health. 100 grams of cooked cassava provides around 160 calories. It also contains vitamin C, potassium, magnesium, and folate. The protein content is low. Communities that have relied on cassava have always known this. Cassava is almost never eaten in isolation. It's paired with legumes, with fish, with leafy vegetables, with fermented foods, the elements that provide what the root alone cannot, and the leaves, often overlooked entirely. The leaves of the cassava plant are significantly richer in protein and micronutrients than the root itself. Consumed across cassava-growing regions for generations, a part of the plant that most of the formal food system never bothered to examine. Where cassava has been linked to nutritional deficiency, the cause was almost never the root itself. It was scarcity, displacement, the collapse of dietary diversity. A diverse diet built around cassava is nutritionally adequate. A diet of nothing but improperly processed bitter cassava during famine is not. But that's a condition of crisis, not a failure of the plant. The decline of cassava in regions that once relied on it wasn't dramatic. No single prohibition, no burning of fields. What happened was quieter, more structural. Agricultural development programs focused on yield-maximizing monocultures: rice, wheat, maize. Cassava received relatively little investment. Food systems were reorganized around imported grain varieties that required external inputs, external markets, external knowledge. Cassava, which requires none of those things, didn't fit the model. And there was one more obstacle. Fresh cassava roots deteriorate within a day or two of harvest. For communities with established local processing traditions, that's not a problem. For centralized commercial distribution, it's a serious one. The result was a crop that fed hundreds of millions of people in practice, while receiving almost no formal attention in research or policy. That has begun to change. In the last 2 decades, cassava has attracted serious research investment, partly because of its resilience to drought and heat, in a food system under increasing climate pressure. High-protein, low-cyanide varieties are being developed. The qualities that made cassava useful to communities without reliable soil, water, or trade routes are now being recognized as strategically important. None of this required the rediscovery of something lost. It required acknowledgement of something that had been present all along. In the fields of farmers who understood their land, in the kitchens of communities that knew how to prepare what grew near them. In the nutritional record of populations that survived on crops, the formal food system chose not to prioritize. That knowledge didn't need to be recovered. It needed to be seen. This is the pattern that this channel keeps returning to. Practical knowledge, accumulated over centuries, embedded in communities, pushed to the margins not because it stopped working, but because the systems being built around food, medicine, and agriculture were organized around different priorities. The knowledge didn't disappear. It waited. If this kind of history is what you're here for, the living archive will keep going. Every episode is one more piece of the record. Subscribe if you want to keep building it with us. And if you want to go deeper, there's a guide linked below. It's called The Lost Superfoods: 126 Forgotten Foods and Preservation Methods that Kept People Alive Through Wars, Sieges, and Collapse. Foods that required no refrigeration, no supply chain, no system at all. The same kind of practical knowledge this channel keeps returning to. It's linked below. Some knowledge was never lost. It simply needed to be seen.